The moment Nora Ralston heard the man's voice behind her, she knew her secret was already in danger. "You are holding the wrong form," he said, low and certain, like he had been watching her for longer than just this moment. "The one in your hand is for mineral rights. You want the Homestead Act filing. Third stack from the left back table." She turned slowly, because a woman alone in a land office full of hungry, desperate men in the spring of 1889 did not move quickly and did not show surprise. She had learned that lesson the hard way on the road from Kansas City, learned it in the dark of a Cattletown hotel, learned it again on the dusty platform of the Oklahoma Territory railhead, where a man had tried to take her travel bag with her deed papers still inside it. The man standing beside her was not what she expected. He was tall, with the kind of stillness that comes not from laziness but from discipline, the sort of man who had decided long ago that movement without purpose was wasteful. Dark hair, a few days of stubble, a coat that was good quality but showed real road dust along the shoulders. His hat was pushed back just enough to see his eyes, and his eyes were doing something that surprised her more than anything else about him. They were not appraising her the way every other man in this room had. They were simply watching, the way a person watches a situation they have decided to be part of without having been invited. "I know what form I need," Nora said, because she was not going to let him think she was helpless, even if he was right about the form. He did not argue. He did not smile, not yet. He simply nodded once, as though her correction was perfectly reasonable, and then he looked forward again at the line ahead of them, which had not moved in 20 minutes and showed no signs of moving soon. That was when she noticed he had no form in his own hands. She looked at his empty hands, then up at his face, and something cold and cautious moved through her. "You are not here to file a claim," she said. "Not today," he answered. "Then why are you standing in this line?" There was a pause that lasted 3 full seconds, which felt, in the silence of that crowded room with dust motes hanging in the morning light and 40-some men shifting their weight and muttering about the weight, like a very long time. "Because you looked like someone who was going to need the morning," he said simply. Nora Ralston had survived 18 months of widowhood, a contested estate, a 3-day train ride into contested land, and the particular terror of being a woman alone trying to claim 160 acres in the Oklahoma land rush aftermath, where men would lie, cheat, forge documents, and worse to get what they wanted. She had not cried once through any of it. She almost cried at that. She did not, because she was Nora Ralston and she had her father's stubbornness and her mother's iron, and she was going to get this land and build something on it or die in the attempt. But she felt the edges of something soften just slightly, some wall she had been maintaining with tremendous effort, and she turned back to face the front of the line and said, very quietly, "Then I suppose you had better stay." And he did. He stayed the whole morning. But she did not know yet, in that moment, what it had cost him to be there. She did not know about the betrayal he was running from, the dark past that had followed him across 3 states, the hidden motive that every man in his former life had assumed drove everything he did, or the forced choice that had brought him to the town of Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory, on the same morning she arrived. She did not know his name was Grant Blackwell, or that his name, in certain circles, was said with a kind of warning attached to it. She did not know that standing beside her in that line was, for him, the first honest thing he had done in over a year. She was about to find out all of it. Nora had arrived in Guthrie 3 days before the morning at the land office, coming in on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line with a single trunk, a carpet bag, and a document wallet that she kept against her body at all times, tucked beneath her traveling coat. The document wallet contained the most important things she owned. It contained the hand-drawn survey map she had commissioned in Kansas City. It contained the letter from the government land agent confirming that the parcel she intended to file on had not yet been claimed as of the previous month. It contained $42.30 in paper money, which was almost everything she had left after the journey. and it contained a single folded photograph of her husband Thomas, who had been dead for 18 months, and whose face she looked at each night not with grief anymore but with a kind of quiet reckoning, the way a person looks at a road they once chose and understands now exactly where it led them. Thomas Ralston had been a good man in the way that some men are good, meaning he caused no intentional harm, loved his wife in a general and unfocused way, worked hard enough, and did not drink to excess. He had also been, without telling Nora, entirely without savings when he died of a fever outside of Wichita, while contracting for a cattle drive he had no business taking. He had left her the photograph, a small house with a lien against it that ate the house entirely, and one piece of paper that his friend Clarence Dodd had given him the month before his death. The paper was a rough description of an unclaimed parcel of land in the Oklahoma Territory, opened up by the federal government following the dissolution of the unassigned lands disputes. Homestead Act land, 160 acres, free, if you filed correctly, built something on it and stayed. It was the only asset she had. Nora had spent 4 months after Thomas died learning everything there was to know about the Homestead Act. She read the revised statutes. She corresponded with land agents. She talked to a lawyer named Hartwell in Kansas City, who told her that a widow filing a loan was entirely within her rights, and that the law would protect her claim so long as she filed properly and established residence. She had taken that information and built it into a plan with the concentration of someone who understands that plans are the only armor available to the genuinely vulnerable. The plan had taken another 8 months to execute, because she needed to save enough money for the journey, for the initial setup on the land, for tools and seed and lumber for a claim shanty. She had done that by working as a seamstress and taking in laundry and refusing every piece of social sympathy that came wrapped in the suggestion that perhaps she ought to marry again and let someone else worry about all of this. Not because she was opposed to love, Nora was not a cold woman, but because she was not going to let desperation make her choices. If she ever stood beside another man at an altar, it would be because she chose it freely, not because she had no alternative. She had arrived in Guthrie with her plan intact, and her money nearly intact and her documents absolutely intact, and she had spent the first day finding a rooming house run by a widow named Mrs. Addie Prentice, who charged reasonable rates and fed her boarders adequately, and asked no pointed questions about a woman traveling alone. She had spent the second day walking the edges of town, getting her bearings, watching how the land office operated, noting the hours and the lines and the way men sometimes emerged looking satisfied and sometimes emerged looking like they had been cheated, which they often had. On the evening of the second day, in the common room of the boarding house over supper, she had overheard a conversation that altered her carefully constructed plan in a way that sent a cold shock through her. 2 men at the adjacent table, a cattle broker named Fenwick Hobbs and a younger man she did not know, were discussing a parcel of land in a way that used reference points she recognized. She did not look up from her plate. She kept her face still. She listened. The parcel they were discussing was her parcel. Fenwick Hobbs was not a large man, but he had the kind of physical presence that comes from accumulated small cruelties. A man who had gotten his way through incremental pressure so many times that his entire body had shaped itself around the habit. He was perhaps 50, with reddish whiskers going gray and eyes the color of shallow water. He spoke with the comfortable authority of someone who had decided the outcome already. He told the younger man that he had a clerk at the land office who had agreed to flag the filing on this particular parcel, that a land speculator from St. Louis named Amos Greer had a competing interest and had already paid to have certain paperwork delayed, and that by Thursday morning, which was the next morning, when the office opened, the whole thing would be resolved in Hobbs's favor. He did not know Nora was there. He did not know that the woman at the next table with her eyes down and her hands folded was the person whose parcel he was casually arranging to steal. Nora had sat very still through the rest of supper, and then gone up to her room and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She thought about going to a lawyer, but Hartwell was in Kansas City, and she did not know any lawyer here and had no money to retain one on a few hours' notice. She thought about going to the marshal, but what she had was eavesdropped conversation, no evidence, and a woman's word against a man with obvious local connections. She thought about simply showing up at the land office as early as possible and filing before any interference could occur. That was what she decided to do. She was at the land office door before sunrise, first in line, with her documents in order and her $42 ready, and her face composed into an expression of absolute determination. By the time the office opened at 8 in the morning, the line behind her had grown to fill the boardwalk and wrap around the corner of the building. By 8:15, she had been edged back somehow, not violently, not with any single decisive act, but through the accumulated small physics of men who moved into space without acknowledging the person already occupying it, so that by 8:30 she was not first in line but seventh, which was still ahead of where Hobbs's people needed her to be, but not the safe position she had held. It was at approximately 8:45, standing seventh in line in the Guthrie Land office on a Thursday morning in April of 1889, that she heard a voice say, "You are holding the wrong form," and Grant Blackwell stepped into the space beside her. Grant Blackwell had come to Guthrie for reasons that had nothing to do with Nora Ralston and everything to do with the consequences of having once been, for 2 years, the best land acquisition agent in the employ of a speculator named Amos Greer. He had not known, when he took the position, exactly what Amos Greer's operation involved. He had known that Greer purchased land, consolidated parcels, and resold them for considerable profit, which was entirely legal and, in the post-Civil War expansion of the American West, was practically the primary occupation of ambitious men. Grant had been good at research, good at travel, good at the quiet legwork of identifying unclaimed or disputed parcels before anyone else found them. Greer had paid him very well. The betrayal, when it revealed itself, was not dramatic. It was a document. A single document that Grant found in Greer's St. Louis office on a Tuesday afternoon in February of 1888, left on the desk by an oversight that would never have occurred if Greer had known his best agent was the kind of man who would not simply put it back and pretend he had not read it. The document was a payment ledger. It listed in ordinary accounting columns a series of payments made to land office clerks, county surveyors, and territorial judges across Kansas, Missouri, and the Oklahoma Territory. Payments for delayed filings, payments for altered surveys, payments for the quiet disappearance of legitimate claims by homesteaders who had no idea their paperwork had been buried, families, widows, small farmers, people who had saved for years to file on their 160 acres and had then been told at some point that their filing was invalid for a technical reason, that the land was already claimed, that their survey was irregular, and who had gone home defeated while Greer's men scooped up the parcel. Grant had looked at that document for a long time. Then he had made a copy of it in his own hand, returned the original to the desk, finished his coffee, and left the building. He had sent the copy to a federal land commissioner he had heard about, a man in Washington who had been making cautious noises about corruption in the territorial land offices. Then he had disappeared from Greer's employ before Greer understood what had happened. That had been 13 months ago. In those 13 months, Grant had moved carefully. He had worked cattle drives for cash money. He had stayed in small towns. He had kept his name quiet. He knew, because a friend in St. Louis had warned him, that Greer had people looking for him, that the ledger copy had reached Washington but the federal investigation moved slowly, and that until it concluded, Grant Blackwell's name meant danger to anyone associated with Amos Greer. He had come to Guthrie because the federal land commissioner had sent a message through a contact, telling him that an agent named Dowd would be in Guthrie to receive a sworn statement from Grant that would serve as the foundation of the federal case. Grant was supposed to meet Dowd on Thursday afternoon. He had arrived Wednesday night, checked into a hotel under a false name, and gone to sleep. He had woken early with the particular alertness of a man who had been careful for over a year, and he had walked the town at dawn to settle his nerves, and he had passed the land office and seen the line forming, and he had seen Nora Ralston. He had not known her name then. He had known only that she was standing first in line in the early morning cold with a document wallet pressed to her side with the focused attention of someone protecting something precious, and that over the course of the next 45 minutes, as men arrived and the crowd thickened, she was being incrementally displaced without anyone touching her, without anyone saying a word, through the simple operation of men who treated space as belonging to them by default. He had watched it happen. He had recognized it. He had seen Greer's operation work the same way a dozen times, the quiet pressure, the small erosions, the steady displacement of people who did not know they were being moved. He had seen, just before he stepped into line beside her, the man he recognized as Fenwick Hobbs standing near the back of the room, talking quietly to a man who worked at the land office clerk's desk. He had seen Hobbs's eyes move to the line, do a quick count, and rest briefly on the woman's seventh from the front with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a plan unfold. Grant Blackwell had been very still for one moment, weighing the exposure against the obligation. He was supposed to stay invisible until his meeting with Dowd that afternoon. Standing in the land office where Hobbs, who was a known associate of Greer's, could see him was exactly the kind of risk he had been carefully avoiding. He stepped into line beside her anyway. There are certain moments in a life that hinge not on calculation, but on a quality of character that overrides calculation, and this was one of those moments for Grant. He could not watch a woman being quietly robbed and do nothing. It was not in him. He told her about the wrong form, which was true, because in the anxiety of the morning she had picked up a mineral rights form, and she put it down with a quick flash of irritation that she controlled beautifully. And then she had looked at his empty hands and understood that he was not here to file, and asked him why he was in the line, and he had told her the closest thing to the truth that was safe to tell, which was that she looked like someone who was going to need the morning, and she had told him to stay. The morning was long and it was complicated, and it was, in stretches, very nearly dangerous. The first hour passed in the kind of slow, grinding tension of bureaucratic waiting, which in 1889 in the Oklahoma Territory was its own special misery, because the land office was understaffed and overdemanded, and the clerks were working under pressures that came from multiple directions, some of them legitimate and some of them not. The line moved in lurches. People left and rejoined. Men argued about queue position with the intensity of men who had staked everything on getting to that counter. Grant stood beside Nora and, without making it obvious, positioned himself to take up the space that would otherwise allow others to edge her out again. He was not large enough to be intimidating in a general sense, but he had the quality of certainty, the way he placed his feet and held his shoulders, that communicated to the men around him that this was not a position he was going to be moved from. Nora noticed. She noticed everything. After the first hour, when the line had condensed and they were forth from the counter, she said, without looking at him, "You recognized someone when you came in." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a sharp observation. I have been practicing sharp observation for the past year and a half," she said. "It keeps you alive when you are doing what I am doing. The man near the back, you knew him." Grant looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the level steadiness of her gaze toward the front of the line. "I know of him," he said carefully. "His name is Hobbs. He is connected to a land speculator out of St. Louis named Amos Greer." There was a pause. He saw her hands tighten slightly on the document wallet, a small tell that she controlled almost immediately. "I overheard Hobbs at supper last night," she said. "He was talking about my parcel. He has a clerk here." "I know," Grant said. She turned and looked at him fully for the first time, the kind of direct examination that most people moderated for the sake of social comfort, and that she apparently had no patience for. Her eyes were gray-green, and they were currently doing something complicated and intelligent that he found, despite everything, quite beautiful. "How do you know?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because I used to work for Greer, and because I know how this particular trap is set." The word hung between them, trap. She let it settle, processing it with that quality of deliberate cognition he was already coming to associate with her, a woman who thought before she reacted, which was rarer than people believed. "Are you here to be part of the trap?" she asked. "No," he said. "Why should I believe that?" "Because if I were part of the trap," he said, "I would have stepped in front of you in line, not beside you." She held his gaze for 3 more seconds, which was a meaningful amount of time in the middle of a crowded land office on a Thursday morning, and then she turned back to face the counter and said, "Fair point. Tell me about the trap." He told her quietly, in the steady, careful shorthand of a person used to passing important information in public places. He told her about the clerk, whose name was a man called Dobbins, who had been on Greer's payroll for at least 8 months, according to the ledger Grant had copied. He told her that the mechanism was usually simple, a claim to a technical irregularity in the filing, a requirement for a corrected survey, a delay that pushed the filing past a deadline that would then allow a competing claim to advance. He told her that the key was to not give Dobbins anything to find irregular, which meant her documents needed to be absolutely perfect, and that the best defense was to ask for a supervisor to review the filing at the same time it was submitted, which created a witness and made any quiet interference much harder. "Can you do that?" he asked. "Ask for the supervisor." "I can do anything that is within the rules," she said, and the way she said it made him believe her completely. He also told her, because she deserved to know the full landscape, that Fenwick Hobbs was almost certainly watching the line, and that when Hobbs saw Grant standing beside her, there was some probability that Hobbs would recognize him, and that things might become more complicated. He did not tell her the full extent of the danger his presence represented, the fact that Greer had people looking for him, the fact that by standing in this land office he was exposing himself in a way he had been carefully avoiding. He told himself he did not tell her because it was unnecessary information that would only increase her anxiety without helping her situation. But there was another reason, one he was not quite ready to examine yet, which was that he did not want her to tell him to leave. Nora listened to all of it without visible alarm and then said, "How bad does it become if Hobbs recognizes you?" "Moderate to significant," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she almost smiled. It was a restrained, careful sort of almost smile, the expression of a woman who had learned to ration warmth, but it reached her eyes for a fraction of a second, and Grant found himself wanting to earn it again immediately. "That is a very calm way to describe danger," she said. "I find calm more useful than alarm," he said. "So do I," she said. And something shifted between them, something small but real, the way a lock gives when the right key finds it, not swinging open but releasing, the tension of resistance becoming suddenly absent. They were third in line. They were second in line when the man behind them, a broad-shouldered cattle rancher with a frustrated energy that had been building for the past 40 minutes, suddenly made a noise of disgust and pushed forward with enough force to bump Nora's shoulder. She stumbled 1 step, caught herself on the counter edge, and turned around, and Grant had already turned around as well. And for one very charged moment, the 3 of them occupied a triangle of about 6 square feet, with considerably more tension in it than the square footage warranted. "Pardon yourself," Nora said to the man behind them, and her voice was so composed and so clearly not asking a question that the man blinked and actually said, "Beg pardon, ma'am," and stepped back. Grant looked at her. She looked at him. He had been half a second from saying something himself, and she had not needed him to. He was not sure why that delighted him as much as it did. "First in line," the clerk called. A man with a survey map the size of a bedsheet stepped forward and began an incomprehensible discussion about water rights that seemed likely to consume a great deal of time. "He is not Dobbins," Nora said, nodding at the clerk dealing with the man ahead of them. "The one at the second window, the one with the red suspenders, that is Dobbins." Grant looked. She was right. There were two processing windows. The man at their window was a tired-looking young clerk with no visible corruption. The man at window 2, red suspenders, careful eyes, was watching the line with the attentive patience of someone waiting for a specific transaction. "He is going to try to route you to his window," Grant said. "Can you prevent it? I can make it inconvenient for him to insist." "Then do," she said. When their window came open and the tired young clerk called for the next person, Nora stepped forward without hesitation and Grant stepped with her. And before Dobbins could call out to redirect her, she had spread her documents on the counter and said clearly, "I am filing a homestead claim under the Act of 1862, and I would like both a standard receipt and a supervisor's review stamp on the filing record, please." The young clerk, whose name badge said Henley, looked mildly surprised and then looked pleased, the way people look when given a clear, organized task. "Yes, ma'am. Documents." She laid them out in order. Survey map, identity papers, residency declaration, the filing fee. Grant watched Dobbins from the corner of his eye and saw the man sit forward slightly, watching, and then sit back, and then write something on a piece of paper. He was communicating, but to whom Grant could not see yet. The filing itself took 14 minutes. Henley was thorough and somewhat slow, but entirely honest as far as Grant could observe, checking each document against the registry, stamping the survey, confirming the parcel number against the master record. When he found, on the second cross-check, that the parcel was flagged in the register, a small notation that Grant recognized as the kind of administrative delay marker that Greer's people used, Nora asked, in a voice so level it could have been used as a spirit level, "What does that flag indicate and who placed it?" Henley looked at it, looked at her, and called for the supervisor. The supervisor was a man named Alderman, barrel-chested, 60s, with the look of someone who had been administering this office through the chaos of the land rush and was tired but not corrupt. He looked at the flag, asked Henley when it had been entered, learned it had been entered the previous afternoon, and asked by whom. The register showed it had been entered under Dobbins' clerk code. "What is the stated reason for the flag?" Nora asked. Alderman looked at it. The stated reason was a survey irregularity. "What survey irregularity?" Nora said. "My survey was completed by a licensed surveyor in Kansas City, commissioned through a federal land agent. The survey number is registered with the General Land Office in Washington." She had the registration number memorized. She recited it. Alderman wrote it down and then looked at the flag again and then looked at Dobbins, who was now watching the exchange with the fixed attention of a man watching something he cannot stop. "I am going to clear this flag and complete the filing," Alderman said, in the tone of a man making a decision that he knows will have consequences he will deal with later. "The survey appears to be in order." "Thank you," Nora said. She signed the filing document in a clear, steady hand. Alderman countersigned and supervisor stamped it. Henley completed the receipt. Nora paid the filing fee, took her copies, folded them with careful precision into her document wallet, pressed the wallet against her body, and turned from the counter with an expression on her face that Grant had not seen before on any person in any similar situation. It was not relief, not quite. It was something more controlled and more earned than relief. It was the face of someone who had done exactly what they set out to do and had known, all along, that they were capable of doing it. He felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a long time, something warm and a little disorienting, like stepping out of cold shadow into sunlight. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. They walked out of the land office together into the April morning, and for 30 feet neither of them said anything, and then Grant said, "Will you let me buy you coffee, Mrs. Ralston?" Because he had heard Henley call her by name during the filing, and he was not going to pretend he had not. She stopped and looked at him with that direct examination again, the one that seemed to be cataloging information she would weigh later. "You know my name, but I do not know yours," she said. "Grant Blackwell," he said. She considered it. "You are known to Hobbs's people. Being seen with you may create a complication for my claim." "It might," he said honestly. "And you are meeting with someone this afternoon about the federal case against Greer." He stared at her. "How do you know that?" "You said you sent documentation to a federal land commissioner 13 months ago. You came to Guthrie for a reason. The timing of the federal investigation into land office corruption in the Oklahoma Territory, which I read about in 2 separate newspaper accounts before I made this trip, suggests that there is active federal activity here right now. You are the source or close to it." She paused. "I am very good at connecting information." He looked at her for a long moment. He had been careful for 13 months. He had been careful in ways that had become second nature. And this woman had just assembled a reasonably accurate picture of his situation from approximately 20 minutes of conversation and some newspaper reading. He was not frightened by it. He was genuinely and thoroughly impressed. "You are extraordinary," he said, and he said it the way he said things, plainly, without decoration, and she received it the same way, with a slight pause and a slight warmth in her eyes that she managed not to let become a full smile, but that was heading in that direction. "Coffee," she said. "I know where there is a decent pot. The rooming house where I am staying serves it in the common room until noon." They walked to the rooming house. The April morning in Guthrie was golden and cool, the town around them in its particular 1889 phase of frantic becoming. Buildings going up on lots that had been bare dirt 3 weeks earlier, the noise of hammers and sawing mixing with horse traffic, and the general clamor of a place making itself up as it went along. Nora walked with her document wallet still pressed against her side, even though the filing was complete and she could let it rest. And Grant noticed this and understood it, the way the body holds alert long after the danger has passed. "At the rooming house, Mrs. Prentice poured coffee and gave them a corner of the common room and the courtesy of not hovering. Grant wrapped his hands around the cup and felt the warmth of it and realized he had been tense for the entire morning in a way that was only now releasing. "Tell me the rest of it," Nora said. Not a question. An invitation she was extending because she had decided he was worth extending it to. So he told her. He told her about working for Greer, about the 2 years of acquisition work, about what he had understood his job to be and what it actually was. He told her about the ledger. He told her about the copy and the federal land commissioner, and the 13 months of careful movement across 3 states. He told her about his meeting this afternoon with the commissioner's agent, a man named Dowd, who would take his sworn statement and use it as the cornerstone of a case that, if it held, would result in federal charges against Greer and the dismantling of his network of corrupt clerks and surveyors. He told her about the risk of being seen with him, the real risk, not the moderate version he had given her in the line. If Hobbs reported to Greer that Grant Blackwell was in Guthrie, Greer would know the federal investigation was active and close, and he might do something preemptive. What that preemptive action looked like, Grant was not entirely certain, but it was not nothing, because Amos Greer was not a man who accepted consequences quietly. Nora listened to all of it over 2 cups of coffee with the complete attentiveness of someone who is not just hearing but filing, organizing, understanding. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Did Hobbs see you clearly this morning?" "I believe so, yes." "Then the calculation has already been made," she said. "The exposure is done. There is no benefit to pretending it is not. That is correct. Then the question is what you do between now and your meeting with Dowd this afternoon to make sure it goes forward without interference." She looked at him steadily. "And I would like to help." Grant put down his cup. He looked at her across the table in the morning light with the noise of the young boomtown around them, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke and fresh lumber in the air. and he understood that something was happening that he had not planned for, and that was, despite every precaution, entirely beyond his ability to step back from. Not the practical situation of the afternoon, the meeting with Dowd, the federal case. Something else. Something to do with the particular quality of this woman's attention and the way she talked about things, direct and undecorated, like they were both professionals with a shared problem, like she was not performing anything for him and not asking him to perform anything in return. He had been alone for a long time. Not just the 13 months of running, but before that too, the particular loneliness of a man who has spent years doing work he is not proud of and has no one to tell the truth to. He had told her more in one morning than he had told anyone in 3 years. "You do not need to help," he said. "Your part of this is done, your claim is filed." "I know I do not need to," she said. "I am offering because I want to. The man you are trying to take down stole from people like me. It is personal." He considered her for a long moment. "You are not afraid of this," he said, meaning all of it, the land office, Hobbs, Greer's network, the stakes of the afternoon. "I am afraid of quite a lot of things," she said. "I simply do not let the fear make my decisions." He smiled then for the first time, and it was a full smile, the kind that changes the entire landscape of a person's face. And Nora Ralston, who had promised herself that she was not going to be moved by a man's smile, was moved by it anyway, just slightly, just enough to matter. She looked away first. She looked down at the document wallet on the table beside her. She thought of Thomas's photograph inside it and felt the particular guilt of someone who is experiencing something new while still carrying something old, and she breathed through it and set it aside for later examination, because the present moment required her full attention. "Tell me about Dowd," she said. "Where are you meeting him and at what time?" They spent an hour planning. Grant told her about Dowd, whose cover was that of a federal land surveyor on a routine territorial inspection, which was common enough to be invisible and provided good reason to be in and around the land office. They were supposed to meet at 3 in the afternoon at the survey office on the east end of town, away from the main land office, in what Dowd's message had called a routine survey consultation. Grant needed to arrive there on time with his sworn statement prepared, without Hobbs or anyone working for Hobbs following him. Nora suggested a route that she had mapped during her second day in Guthrie, the day she had walked the town. It took a back street between the general merchandise stores, crossed behind the livery, and came out 2 lots from the survey office without passing any of the main commercial thoroughfares where Hobbs's people were likely to be watching. She drew it on paper with the casual precision of a woman who thought spatially and observed carefully, and Grant looked at it and thought, not for the first time that morning, that she was remarkable. "I will walk part of the way with you," she said. "If Hobbs's people are watching for you, they are watching for a man alone." A man and woman walking together draw a different kind of attention. "Domestic attention," he said. "People assume something ordinary." "Exactly." She folded the paper and pushed it to him. "I will also speak to Alderman again this afternoon before he leaves the office. I want his full statement on record about the flag that Dobbins placed on my parcel. If Greer attempts any kind of delayed challenge to my claim, I want the supervisor's testimony already documented." "That is very well thought out," Grant said. "I have had 18 months of practice at being very well thought out," she said, and this time there was something underneath the words that was not pride but something quieter and more private, and Grant did not push on it but filed it carefully. "Mrs. Ralston," he said. "Nora," she said, with the slightly surprised decisiveness of a person who has just made a choice they did not consciously prepare. She looked at him and then looked at the table. "If we are going to spend the afternoon thwarting land speculators together, you may as well call me Nora." "Grant," he said. She nodded once as though they had signed a document. The late morning passed. Nora returned to her room and wrote up a careful account of the morning's events at the land office, the conversation she had overheard from Hobbs, the flag on her parcel, Dobbins' behavior, Alderman's decision. She wrote it in the detailed, dated, witnessed format that she had learned from reading legal documents, the kind that would hold up if needed. She planned to have Mrs. Prentice read and witness it. She wrote a second copy. Then she sat for a moment with Thomas's photograph in her hand, and she talked to him in her head the way she had sometimes done in the past 18 months, not because she believed he could hear her, but because it helped her organize her own feelings. She told him she thought she might be in some danger of losing her cautious distance from the world. She told him she had met a man who told the truth in a way that felt unusual and important. She told him she was going to be fine either way, and that she knew the difference between a desperate choice and a genuine one, and that she intended to take her time. She put the photograph away. She went down to the common room and asked Mrs. Prentice to witness her document. At 2 in the afternoon, she met Grant outside the rooming house, in the bright afternoon light of a town that smelled of sawdust and horse and new paint. He looked, she noticed, calmer than he had any right to look given the afternoon ahead of him. He also looked, in the afternoon light with the road dust off him and his hat set properly, quite good. She noted this the way she noted everything factually, and then set it aside. They walked east through the side streets she had mapped. He told her, as they walked, about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had been a land clerk himself, honest and underpaid, about the particular irony of ending up, through a chain of plausible-seeming steps, working for the very kind of operation that had made his father's honest work meaningless. He said it without self-pity, simply as a fact he had reckoned with. She told him about growing up in Kansas, about a mother who had been a school teacher and who had taught her daughters that an understanding of the law was not optional. She told him about Thomas in the way she had come to be able to talk about Thomas, with clarity and appropriate sadness but without the incapacitating grief of the first months. "He sounds like a man who meant well," Grant said. "He did," she said. "Meaning well and doing well are not always the same thing. He taught me that too, though not intentionally." Grant was quiet for a moment. "The land," he said, "the 160 acres. What do you intend to do with it?" "Build a house," she said, as though this were simple. "Plant a kitchen garden, establish a small herd of cattle, initially perhaps 12 head, enough to generate income. File for the additional acres available after 5 years under the Timber Culture Act. Create something that is mine." "Alone," he said, and there was nothing presumptuous in how he said it, only the genuine curiosity of a man who is paying full attention. "Alone to begin with," she said. "I am 30 years old. I am not in a hurry to make decisions about the future that I do not need to make right now." He looked at her as they walked. "That is wise," he said. "How old are you?" she asked. 34, he said. She nodded. The numbers were sensible, she noted to herself, and then was quietly amused at herself for noting it. They were half a block from the survey office when they saw the problem. 2 men were standing in the shallow shadow of the hardware store across the street from the survey office, not doing anything obvious, not appearing to watch anything specific, but with the particular quality of stillness that men have when they are positioned rather than passing. Grant saw them a half-second before Nora did, and she felt the slight change in how he walked, an almost imperceptible reorientation. "Hobbes's men," she said quietly. "Or Greer's directly," he said. "Which means Hobbes communicated my presence here more quickly than I hoped." They kept walking at the same pace. They did not look at the men. Nora said quietly, "If you go in through the front, they will follow you in." "Yes." "Is there a rear entrance to the survey office?" "I do not know." "I do," she said. "There is an alley that runs behind the east side of this block. I walked it 2 days ago. The survey office has a storage entrance at the rear used for map deliveries, large flat packages. It will be unlocked during business hours." He looked at her. "You walk the alleys." "I walked the entire town," she said. "As I said, I have been practicing." "The alley," he said. "How do we reach it without them seeing us turn for it?" "We walk past the hardware store as if we are going to the dry goods 2 doors further on," she said. "We go in. We go through and out the back door, which will put us in the alley. We follow it east. You enter the survey office from the rear. I wait in the alley. That is a good plan, he said. I have been making good plans for 18 months, she said. And this time when she said the familiar phrase, there was a slight edge of something else in it. Something that might have been loneliness if she had let it be, and Grant heard it, and he did not remark on it, but he heard it. They went into the dry goods store, which was crowded enough with afternoon shoppers that their entrance was not remarkable. Grant bought a paper of pins he did not need, for the perfectly ordinary appearance of a customer completing a transaction. They went out the back, into the alley, which smelled of dust and dry wood and the distant cooking fires of the town. It was quiet back there. Nora stood against the wall, and Grant looked at her for a moment that stretched past what was strictly necessary. "Go," she said quietly. "Dowd is waiting." "I know," he said. He did not move immediately. "When I am done, I am going to find you." "I will be at the rooming house," she said. "Unless Alderman is still available for a statement, in which case I will be briefly at the land office." "Nora," he said, and her name and his voice sounded different from how it had sounded in the common room, lower and more serious, with something beneath it that she felt in the middle of her chest. "Go," she said again, but more gently. "I will be there." He went. She stood in the alley for a few minutes, then walked back through the dry goods out the front and turned left toward the land office. She did not look at the two men near the hardware store. She walked with the ordinary purpose of a woman with somewhere to be, and she did not allow herself to think about anything except the statement she was going to ask Alderman to make until she was inside the land office, and the immediate situation required her full attention. Alderman was still there, as she had hoped, in the back office, with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of papers, and the look of a man who stayed late as a matter of course. He received her request for a formal statement with the gravity it deserved, and he was, she thought, a genuinely honest man in a position that had been made very difficult for honest men, and she felt a clean respect for him. He wrote the statement. She witnessed it. She left with a copy. She went back to the rooming house and sat in her room and waited. The meeting with Dowd took 2 hours. Grant sat across from a compact, precise man in his 40s with a surveyor's kit that was entirely genuine and a federal appointment that was not on any public record. And he gave his sworn statement in full, from the beginning of his employment with Greer to the day. He found the ledger to every detail of the ledger he could recall, which was considerable because he had read it 3 times before replacing it, and he had a good memory for numbers. Dowd asked careful questions and wrote in a small hand that was nearly illegible to anyone else. At the end, Dowd told him that the case was close, that Grant's testimony was the central piece they needed, that there would likely be federal warrants within the month, and that until then Grant should maintain his current low profile. "I may have lost the low profile this morning," Grant said. "I heard," Dowd said. He looked at Grant with the measured assessment of a federal man weighing a complication. "The woman, Ralston, she is not a problem." "She is not a problem," Grant said. "She is, if anything, an asset. She has documentation of this morning's events at the land office that supports the case against Dobbins." Dowd raised an eyebrow. "She prepared it herself," Grant said. "Without being asked. She is thorough," Dowd made a note. "I may want to speak with her." "I will ask her," Grant said. He left through the same rear entrance, crossed the alley, and walked to the rooming house in the late afternoon light of a town settling into evening, the hammers gone quieter now, the horses stabled, the particular golden hour of the frontier day when everything was briefly beautiful and briefly still. He knocked at the door of the rooming house. Mrs. Prentice answered and told him Mrs. Ralston was in the common room. He found her at the corner table where they had sat in the morning, with a lamp lit against the early evening and a cup of tea and a book she was not reading, because her eyes were on the door. She looked at him when he came in, and he could see her read his face the way she read everything, quickly and accurately, and she said, "It went well." "It went well," he confirmed. She sat back. The tension she had been carrying for the entire afternoon released from her shoulders in a way that told him she had been more worried than she had let show, which was not surprising and was, in its own way, another kind of tenderness, that she had been worried for him. He sat down across from her. Mrs. Prentice brought another cup without being asked. Outside, the sounds of Guthrie in the evening were ordinary and peaceful, and inside this corner of the common room, with the lamp and the tea and the day's business finally concluded, Grant Blackwell felt something settle in him that had not been settled in a very long time. They talked until supper and through supper, and for an hour after, and the conversation moved through everything, the practical and the personal, the land and the federal case and the town and the future and the past, and all the small intermediate things that people tell each other when they are finding out who the other person is. He learned that she had a sister in Wichita who thought she was reckless. He learned that she was an excellent rider, but had not ridden much in the past 2 years because she had been focused on saving money and horses were expensive. He learned that she read widely, legal texts and geography and natural history and novels, and that she was not apologetic about the novels. He told her about Missouri and the cattle drives, and the specific solitude of the kind of work he had been doing for 13 months, which was not romanticized solitude, but the actual functional kind, the kind that wears on a person. He told her that he did not know what he was going to do when the case was resolved and Greer was no longer a threat, that he had not made plans beyond the next immediate step for so long that the idea of a horizon was genuinely strange to him. She looked at him with the lamp light on her face and said, "You should make some plans." "I am beginning to think so," he said. He meant it to be about his general future, and it was about that, but it was also about something more specific and more present, and she knew it. He could see that she knew it, and she did not look away from it this time. "I am going to be on my land within the week," she said. "There is a great deal of work to be done." A pause. "It is 160 acres. I have only filed for it so far. I have not seen it except on a map." "Would you like company when you go to see it?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, not considering whether she wanted company. He thought she was considering whether to say yes to what they both understood was a larger question than acreage. "Yes," she said, "I would." He left for his hotel with the particular feeling of a man who has spent a very long day doing something that mattered and who has, entirely unexpectedly, found something more significant in the middle of it than he went in looking for. The next days were busy in ways that kept them both occupied but brought them together at the edges of every task, the way things come together at margins when the center is too full to hold them. Grant met with Dowd a second time to answer follow-up questions. Nora visited the land office again to confirm her filing was in final order, to deliver her statement to Dowd when he requested it, and to check the transportation options for reaching her parcel, which was 7 miles south of Guthrie on the South Canadian River watershed, accessible by a wagon road that had been cleared by the land rush surveyors but was still rough. Hobbs's men continued to be visible in town, which both of them noted and discussed, but Hobbs himself seemed to be pulling back. Grant thought it was possible that Hobbs had communicated Grant's presence to Greer and had been instructed to stand down pending further guidance, which was consistent with how Greer operated when something complicated arose. The larger move would come from Greer directly, and it might not come at all, because Greer was not a man who committed to direct action when subtlety was still on the table. On Saturday morning, 3 days after the land office, they hired a wagon from the livery and drove south out of Guthrie along the rough new road through the red-earthed Oklahoma spring countryside, with the sky enormous above them and the land rolling in long green and brown grasses on all sides, and the particular sweetness of the late April air on the plains. Nora did not speak much on the drive. She looked. Grant drove and let her look and did not intrude on it, because he understood that this was something she had been building toward for 18 months, and it required its full space. When they turned down the track that the surveyor's map indicated was the boundary road of her parcel, she said very quietly. There. The land was beautiful. Not spectacular, not the kind of dramatic beauty that makes paintings, but the deep, patient beauty of good land, the steady rise and fall of it, the creek line visible through a stand of cottonwood trees, the prairie grass already showing green after a wet spring. It was exactly what the map had shown. 160 acres of the kind of land that wanted to be farmed, that had the bone structure of productivity in its drainage and its soil color, and the direction of its slope. Nora climbed down from the wagon before it fully stopped, something she would not normally do, and she walked out into the grass in her good traveling boots, and she stood there with her hands at her sides, and Grant watched her from the wagon seat and did not say anything. After a while she turned and looked back at him, and her face was entirely open, all the careful management of expression gone, just Nora Ralston standing on her land looking at him with something that was joy and grief and relief and fierce, ferocious hope all at once. He got down from the wagon and walked out to where she was standing. "It is real," she said. "It is real," he said. "I did it," she said. "You did it," he said. And then, because there was nothing more accurate that he could say and because the moment asked for it, he said, "Thomas would have been proud." She looked at him with a surprise that shifted quickly into something warm and complicated. "How do you know what Thomas would have thought?" "Because you loved him, and you made this happen, and anyone who was loved by you and knew you well enough to know what you are capable of would have been proud," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I do not always know what to do with someone who sees me clearly." "I know the feeling," he said. "I have been invisible for a long time by necessity." She looked at him, and the word necessity lay between them with all its weight. "What will you do when the case is finished?" she asked, not with any implication, simply asking. "I do not know," he said. "I know I am not going back to acquisition work. I know I want to do something that has a result I can see and account for. Land, perhaps. Actual land, not speculation, not paperwork and transfers. Something with my hands." He looked at the cottonwood trees along the creek. "Something with a horizon." She followed his gaze. 160 acres is not enough for cattle on any significant scale," she said. "But the Timber Culture Act allows an additional 160 if you plant trees, and the government has been talking about additional homestead allocations." She was not saying anything yet, just thinking out loud in the way she had, and he listened the way he had learned to listen to her, for what was underneath the information. "This is good land," he said. "It is very good land," she said. And then she looked at him directly with that gray-green directness and said, "I am not in a hurry and I am not going to make desperate choices. But I want you to know that I see you clearly too, Grant Blackwell. And what I see is someone I would like to continue seeing." It was the most direct and simultaneously the most guarded declaration of feeling he had ever received, perfectly in character, entirely Nora, and he found it more affecting than a great deal of poetry. "Then I will stay where you can see me," he said, "for as long as you want me here." She nodded once, as though they had signed another document. And then she turned and walked back toward the creek, and he walked beside her, and they spent the afternoon on her land mapping where the house might go and where the kitchen garden would be, and where the cattle shed should be situated relative to the prevailing wind. And they talked the way people talk when they are building something together in their minds before they have built it in the world, and neither of them called it what it was yet, but both of them knew. The federal warrants came down 6 weeks later. Grant was still in Guthrie, which he had ceased pretending was temporary after the 3rd week. He was working for the livery, which needed a man who could handle horses and do repairs, and he was helping Nora on weekends with the initial work on her land, the claim shanty first, a small but well-built structure that would serve as her residence while she developed the property. He had a facility for construction that surprised her, until she remembered that he had told her his father was a land clerk who had also built his own house in Missouri, and that Grant had grown up with a hammer in his hand, alongside whatever else his life had put there. Dowd came to the rooming house on a Tuesday morning in early June with the warrants in his portfolio and a satisfaction in his face that federal men do not typically show. Amos Greer had been arrested in St. Louis 2 days previous. Fenwick Hobbs was arrested in Guthrie the same morning Dowd came to the rooming house, at roughly the hour that Grant and Nora were reading the Telegraph notice of Greer's arrest in the Guthrie newspaper. The clerk Dobbins resigned from the land office before noon and was arrested leaving town by a pair of federal deputy marshals. 4 other clerks across the territory were arrested or dismissed in the same operation. Nora read the newspaper account twice and then folded it carefully and put it on the table and looked at Grant over her coffee cup with the expression of a woman setting down a very heavy thing she had been carrying for a long time. "It is finished," she said. "It is finished," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You can go anywhere now." "I know," he said. "Where will you go?" She asked, and this time there was something in the question that was not neutral, that had a weight behind it she did not entirely conceal. "I have been thinking about filing a Timber Culture Act claim," he said. "There is a parcel adjacent to yours that is still available. I checked the register last week." She put down her coffee cup. "You checked the register. Adjacent parcels under the Timber Culture Act can be consolidated after 5 years if the owner chooses to apply," he said. "Combined, they would constitute a viable cattle and farming operation of significant scale." She was looking at him with the full force of her attention, not performing anything, just watching him with gray-green eyes that saw clearly and required him to see clearly in return. "Grant," she said. "I am not proposing anything reckless," he said. "I am proposing a claim filing. The rest of it can develop at whatever pace makes sense." "You are proposing a great deal more than a claim filing," she said. "Yes," he said, "I am, but I am willing to start with the claim filing if that is what is appropriate." She was quiet for a long moment, not uncertain. She was doing what she always did, which was feeling everything fully before she let it become a decision. He waited. He had learned to wait for her, the particular patience that genuine attention requires. "File the claim," she said. And then, after a pause of about 3 seconds, she added, "and stay for dinner." He smiled, and she let herself smile back, fully this time, not restrained, not rationed. And it was the most beautiful thing in that room, and it had been building since an April morning when a man appeared beside a woman in a land office line, and stayed the whole morning through. He filed the claim that week. The summer on the land was the hardest and best work Grant Blackwell had ever done. He set up a camp on his parcel and spent the days between his livery shifts and his weekends on the work of establishing a claim, the planting of the first 100 trees required by the Timber Culture Act, the digging of a well, the gradual construction of something that was beginning to look like a permanent life rather than a temporary position. Nora's claim shanty became over the summer a proper one-room house with a real roof and a plank floor, and a cook stove that she had bought from a hardware supply wagon. And on the evenings when they ate together on her land with the prairie evening around them and the smell of new wood and turned earth, Grant thought that this was the most honest he had been in years and possibly in his life. He asked her on an evening in August, when the Oklahoma summer was beginning to ease toward fall, and the grass was going gold, and the creek ran low but clear, sitting outside on the step she had built for her door with coffee cups in their hands and the whole evening horizon open ahead of them. He did not make a speech. He said, "Nora, I would like to marry you." She looked at the horizon for a moment. He let her. "I am going to ask you a question first," she said. "Ask anything," he said. "When you came to Guthrie 6 months ago," she said, "you were already on your way out of the life you had been living. You had found something worth risking everything for in that ledger. You had already made the choice to be a different kind of man. Would you have made the same choice if you had not met me? If you had simply met with Dowd and gone on your way?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think I would have continued making the choice," he said. "The honest part, the putting things right, that was already in motion." A pause. but I do not think I would have understood what I was making it for, what it was building toward. He looked at her profile, the clean, determined line of it against the evening. I needed to see what it looked like when it worked, when someone built something real from the ground up, honestly by themselves, without anyone to rescue them or carry them. He paused. You showed me what the honest life looks like when it is done all the way. She was quiet for a moment, receiving that. Then she said, "The answer is yes." He took her hand where it rested on her knee. Her fingers closed around his with the same directness that characterized everything she did, deliberate and certain and without performance. They sat on the step of her house on her land in the August evening and watched the sun go down over the Oklahoma territory, and it was, by any measure available, entirely enough. They were married in October, at a small ceremony in the Guthrie church that had been built in the summer, attended by Mrs. Prentice and her husband, the land office supervisor alderman, and his wife, Dowd, who came through on federal business and stayed for the wedding because he had come to have a respect for both of them that went past professional, and Nora's sister Clara, who came down from Wichita and cried through the whole service, and said afterward that she had known Nora would end up doing something extraordinary, but she had not expected extraordinary to look quite like this. The minister asked them to speak their promises to each other, and they did, and Nora said, among the traditional words, that she promised to see him clearly and to require him to see her clearly in return, and Grant said, among his traditional words, that he promised to be worth seeing. The minister found this somewhat irregular, and the small congregation found it entirely appropriate. The following spring they expanded the house and planted the first serious kitchen garden, and brought 12 head of cattle onto Nora's original parcel. Grant's adjacent timber culture claim was in its second year of tree establishment and looking well, the seedling cottonwoods and hackberries in their planted rows already showing real height. They filed for the consolidation paperwork that would eventually make the two parcels one, which Nora handled herself with the kind of documentary precision that had become her signature, and which went through the land office, now properly staffed and under alderman's full supervision, with complete efficiency. In the second spring, in late April, almost exactly a year after the morning they had stood together in the land office line, Nora told Grant that she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen of the house, over breakfast, with the directness she brought to everything, and Grant put down his coffee cup and looked at her for a moment that had no words adequate to it, and then he went to her and held her in the morning light of the kitchen on the land they had built together, and neither of them said anything for a while, because nothing needed to be said. The baby was a boy, born in December of 1890, during the first real winter on the land. They named him Thomas James Blackwell, the Thomas for the man who had left Nora a piece of paper that started all of this, and the James for Grant's father. He arrived in the world with dark hair and gray-green eyes that could not decide whose they were, and with a quality of alert attentiveness that Nora said was entirely his father's, and that Grant said was entirely hers, and that was probably both of them in equal measure, which was as it should be. The first years on the land were hard in the ways that homestead farming in the Oklahoma territory was always hard, the weather unpredictable, the market prices for cattle and grain subject to fluctuations that could be devastating in bad years, the work unrelenting. There were a dry summer in 1891 that nearly broke the kitchen garden and reduced the creek to a series of disconnected pools, and required them to haul water daily for the cattle, which was grinding labor in the summer heat. There was a dispute with a neighboring claimant over a fence line that required 3 months of legal correspondence before it was resolved in their favor. There was the particular loneliness of frontier winters when the weather closed in, and the nearest town was a long, cold ride, and the work of the land did not stop for weather. But there were also mornings when the Oklahoma sky was enormous and blue, and the cattle were settled in the south pasture, and the house smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and Thomas was playing on the kitchen floor with the wooden horse his uncle from Wichita had sent. And Grant and Nora sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and the week's newspaper, which arrived 2 days late but still. And the particular piece of a life built honestly by two people who saw each other clearly was present in every ordinary thing. Nora's sister Clara came to visit in the spring of 1892 and stayed 3 months, longer than anyone expected, and when she left she was clearly changed in some way that she could not quite articulate, softened in her skepticism about what her sister had done. She told Nora, the morning before she left, that she understood now why Nora had done it, all of it, the documents and the journey and the land office and the life on the plains. "You are not just surviving," Clara said. "You are actually living. That is harder than I thought." Nora embraced her sister with the warmth she had always had but had sometimes not had the security to fully express, and she said, "It becomes easier when you stop doing it alone." The federal case against Greer concluded in 1892, after 3 years of proceedings that moved with the particular slow certainty of federal justice in that era. Greer was convicted on multiple counts of bribery and mail fraud and conspiracy to defraud homestead claimants. He received a substantial prison sentence. Dobbins and 2 other clerks received lesser sentences. Hobbs was convicted of conspiracy and served time before being released, and as far as Grant ever heard afterward, Hobbs left the territory and did not return. The general land office reforms that followed the case were substantial and lasting, and Grant's name appeared in the federal proceeding record as the key cooperating witness whose testimony had made the case possible. He was not, in the years that followed, a man who thought much about that record. He was, in the years that followed, a man who thought mostly about the parcel of land he was responsible for, and the woman he was responsible to, and the boy who was learning to walk the same year Greer went to prison, and later the second child, a daughter born in 1893, whom they named Addie Francis, the Addie for Mrs. Prentice who had given Nora shelter in the first uncertain days, and who had become in the years since something close to a grandmother to both children. By 1895, the 2 parcels had been formally consolidated into 320 acres under a single title. The cattle herd had grown to 40 head. The claim shanty of the first year was entirely unrecognizable under the expansion of the house, which was now a proper 4-room structure with a covered porch on the south side that caught the evening light, and from which you could see the full sweep of their land from the Cottonwood Creek to the north fence. On an evening in the late spring of 1895, Nora sat on that porch and nursed Addie Francis while Thomas, who was 4½ and very serious about everything, sat on the porch step and explained to a beetle the correct way to cross the yard. Grant came out from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, and they watched Thomas and the beetle for a while and listened to the Oklahoma evening, which in late spring was full of meadowlark song and the distant lowing of cattle and the smell of the grass coming in on the south breeze. "Do you remember," Nora said, "the morning I told you about, where I stood in the land office line and the man in red suspenders kept looking at us?" "Dobbins," Grant said. "I was so angry that morning," she said. "I was standing there with everything I owned in a wallet against my chest, and I was so angry at how it all worked, how they made it so hard for someone like me to just file a simple legal claim." She looked at Addie Francis in her arms with the expression that motherhood had drawn out of her, unguarded and warm in a way that still occasionally surprised Grant because it contrasted so beautifully with the composed, precise woman the rest of the world mostly saw. "And then you appeared beside me." "With no form in my hands," he said. "With no form in your hands," she agreed, smiling. "And you told me I had the wrong form." "You did have the wrong form," he said. "I know," she said. "I had been holding that form for 20 minutes and I knew it was wrong, and I was too stubborn to go back and get the right one while I was still holding my position in the line." He laughed, which was a sound she still loved, full and unhurried. "You never told me that before." "I did not want to give you the satisfaction," she said. "You were already very pleased with yourself for knowing about the form." I was not, he said. You were slightly, she said. He considered this. Possibly slightly, he admitted. She leaned against him on the porch swing, which was the one piece of furniture he had made himself with genuine pride, fitting the chain and the slats and the particular easy movement of it just right. He put his arm around her. Thomas had concluded his lecture to the beetle and was now attempting to determine if it was the kind of beetle that could be encouraged to walk on a stick. The meadowlark was in the cottonwood east of the house. The Oklahoma evening was going gold around them, and the land, their land, lay out in every direction with the patient beauty of good land that has been honestly worked. I think about that morning sometimes, Grant said. What would have happened if I had not come in early, if I had not walked past the land office on my way back from wherever I was, if I had decided that staying out of sight was more important than what I saw happening to you in that line? You were not going to decide that, she said. That is not who you are. I did not know that with certainty at the time, he said. I did, she said, within about the first 5 minutes. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention he had always given her, the kind that made her feel fully visible in a way she had once found disconcerting and now could not imagine living without. I love you, he said simply, the way he said things. I love you, she said in the same register, undecorated and entirely true. Thomas came back to the porch with the beetle on a stick, triumphant. It walked on it, he announced. I told it the correct way. Of course you did, Nora said. Little Addie Francis, full and sleepy in Nora's arms, made a sound of general agreement and closed her eyes, and the evening continued around them, unhurried and whole. Grant Blackwell thought, sitting on that porch with the woman he loved and the children they had made together, and the land they had built together from 160 acres of Oklahoma prairie grass, and a filed document, and a single morning when he had appeared beside a woman in a line and stayed, that there was no part of this life that he could not account for cleanly. Every decision that had brought him here was visible to him, and he was not ashamed of any of them, not even the ones made in error, because they had all been part of the road, and the road had brought him here, which was exactly where he intended to remain. In the years that followed, the land grew, and so did the family. Thomas grew into a boy of tremendous seriousness and surprising humor, who inherited his mother's facility with documents and his father's patience with practical work, and who by the age of 10 was managing the daily log of the cattle operation, with a thoroughness that Nora found entirely natural and Grant found quietly astounding. Addie Francis grew into a girl of fierce opinions and easy laughter, who wanted to know the name of every plant on the property, and who spent her afternoons making detailed maps of the land in a hand that already showed her mother's precision. Nora had a third child, another boy, in 1897, born in the house she had built on the land she had claimed alone, and then filled with more life than any single person could have anticipated. They named him Grant Samuel, the Grant because she wanted it there, and the Samuel for no one in particular, just because it was a solid name and he was a solid baby, and Nora had stopped apologizing for the things she wanted. The Land Commission formally recognized the Blackwell claim in 1898 as one of the model homestead operations in the territory, an unsolicited recognition that came with a brief mention in the Guthrie newspaper, and that caused Grant significant embarrassment and Nora significant amusement. She framed the newspaper clipping and put it on the kitchen wall next to Thomas's first cattle log, and a pressed cottonwood leaf from the creek that she had picked up on the very first day. They visited the land together, and that she had kept for no reason she could explain except that it was from that day, and that day was the beginning of everything. On their 10th anniversary, in October of 1899, they drove to Guthrie together, leaving the children with Clara, who had, by this point, left Wichita and settled in a town 30 miles from them, near enough to visit often and far enough to maintain the independence she required. They drove in a good wagon with a matched pair of horses that they had raised on the land, and they went to the church where they had married, and they sat in the same pew they had sat in on their wedding day. And the minister, who was the same minister though considerably older, said a prayer of thanksgiving for a decade of marriage that Nora found moving, and that Grant endured with the good humor of a man who does not particularly require ceremony, but understands that the people he loves do. Afterward they walked through Guthrie, which was no longer the frantic boomtown of 1889, but an established city with brick buildings and a proper main street, and the accumulated weight of 10 years of civic life. They walked to the block where the land office was, and they stood outside it in the October morning with the familiar smell of the plains on the air, and Nora looked at the door of the land office, and then at Grant, and then she took his arm the way she had not taken it in the line because she had not known him yet, and she looked up at him with gray-green eyes, and the expression that he had learned over 10 years was her version of everything, all of it, the whole impossible, honest, constructed from nothing life that they had built together. "I was so angry that morning," she said again, the same words she had said on the porch that spring evening 4 years ago, but meaning something different now, meaning something that included the anger and the fear and the 18 months of widowhood and the $42.30 and the wrong form and the right man appearing beside her. "I know," he said. "I am not angry anymore," she said. "I know that too," he said. She leaned against him on the boardwalk outside the land office in the October morning, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there for a while, not going in, not needing to go in, simply standing in the place where it had begun and feeling the distance between that morning and this one as the full measure of everything they had built. The sun was warm. The town moved around them. Somewhere down the street a child was laughing. The door of the land office opened, and a woman came out with a document wallet pressed to her side and the focused, fierce expression of someone who had just done something enormous. And Nora watched her and felt a recognition so complete it almost hurt. She straightened and she looked after that woman for a moment, and then she looked up at Grant and she said, "I hope someone appeared beside her today." "Some mornings someone does," he said. She nodded. She took his hand. They walked on into the bright October day of their 10th anniversary in the city where they had begun, and behind them the land office door swung open again for the next person in line, as it had for 10 years and would for many years more. And somewhere on the plains south of the city, 320 acres of consolidated Blackwell land lay under the autumn sun, patient and permanent, as everything built honestly and together tends to be. Tended by the evidence of two people who had found each other at the beginning of something, and had stayed, through all the seasons that followed, right through to the beautiful and ordinary end.